January 17, 1945, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell in sheets that morning, thick and soundless, turning the world into a cathedral of white. Along a forgotten logging road deep in the Ardennes, frost clung to the skeletal branches overhead like torn lace. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Breath turned to ice before it left a man's lips.
Before we continue, if you want more incredible and untold stories, make sure to hit the subscribe button and tell us which country you're watching from.
In that frozen silence, 12 American soldiers lay motionless beneath camouflaged nets, their rifles aimed down a narrow corridor of pines, where the snow had been trampled into gray slush by heavy boots. They had been there for 19 hours. They did not speak. They barely breathed. And somewhere in the valley below, 500 German soldiers were marching directly toward them. This was not supposed to happen. By mid-January of 1945, the German offensive through the Ardennes, what history would call the Battle of the Bulge, was supposed to be collapsing. American reinforcements had arrived. Patton's Third Army had broken through from the south. The weather had cleared enough for Allied aircraft to hammer German supply lines into oblivion. Every strategic map, every intelligence report, every radio intercept suggested that the Wehrmacht was retreating eastward, bleeding and broken, back toward the Rhine. But war does not follow maps, and in the chaos of a collapsing front, entire battalions can vanish into the forest like ghosts, moving through gaps no one thought existed, hunting for one last desperate victory before the spring thaw buried their dreams in mud. The 12 men lying in that snow were not elite commandos. They were not hand-picked heroes. They were what the Army called a scratch squad, survivors pulled from 3 different units that had been mauled in the opening days of the German offensive. Their sergeant, a former steel worker from Pittsburgh named Frank Kowalski, had never commanded more than a fire team before December. Their automatic rifleman, a kid from Iowa named Eddie Price, had been in combat for exactly 9 days. Half of them still had frostbite from sleeping in foxholes during the siege of Bastogne. They had been sent to this logging road not because anyone expected trouble, but because someone needed to watch the northern approach while the main American line consolidated 3 miles south. It was supposed to be a quiet assignment, a place to rest, a place to thaw out and maybe get hot coffee from a supply truck. But Sergeant Kowalski had not survived 3 weeks in the Ardennes by trusting what was supposed to happen. And when his scout, a tobacco-chewing Tennessean named Harlan Webb, had returned from a dawn patrol with his face white as the snow, whispering that he'd spotted German infantry massing in the valley, Kowalski had made a decision that would ripple through the entire American line that day. He did not retreat. He did not call for reinforcements he knew would never arrive in time. Instead, he looked at his 11 exhausted men, at the narrow logging road pinched between 2 steep ridges, at the way the morning light cut through the trees in long cathedral shafts, and he saw something no German planner had accounted for. He saw a killing ground. The German soldiers moving through the valley that morning were not the same Wehrmacht that had blitzed across Europe in 1940. These were the remnants of Kampfgruppe Nordwind, a battle group cobbled together from 3 shattered divisions, reinforced with Volkssturm militia, old men and teenagers pressed into service with 3 weeks of training and rifles that jammed in the cold. They had been marching for 2 days with almost no food. Their winter uniforms were threadbare. Many wore civilian overcoats stolen from Belgian farmhouses. Their orders were simple and desperate: break through the American rear areas, capture the supply depot at Malmedy, and create enough chaos to allow the surviving panzer units to escape encirclement. It was a suicide mission dressed up as strategy, but they marched anyway, because the alternative was surrender, and surrender meant Soviet prison camps for those captured in the East, or worse, the shame of having failed the Führer in the war's final act. Their commander, a a captain named Otto Brandt, had fought in Russia. He had seen what happened to units that hesitated, that questioned orders, that allowed doubt to seep into the ranks like frostbite. So he pushed them forward, 500 men strung out in a column along the valley floor, moving toward what his outdated maps promised was an undefended forest road. He expected resistance eventually, perhaps a roadblock, perhaps a patrol that would scatter at the first exchange of fire. What he did not expect, what no doctrine had prepared him for, was the particular madness of 12 Americans who had decided that retreat was more dangerous than standing their ground. Sergeant Kowalski had positioned his squad with the precision of a man setting a trap. 6 riflemen on the right ridge, prone behind fallen logs. 4 on the left, concealed in a thicket of frozen brambles. Eddie Price, the automatic rifleman, lay in a shallow depression 15 yards ahead of the others, his Browning automatic rifle braced on a rotting stump, its barrel aimed directly down the center of the road. And Kowalski himself crouched at the rear with the squad's only radio, which had stopped working sometime around midnight. There would be no calling for help, no artillery support, no airstrikes, just 12 rifles, 200 rounds per man, and the terrible mathematics of an ambush. The Germans appeared at 0847 hours, not all at once, but in the staggered way of tired men moving through difficult terrain. Advanced scouts first, then the main column stretching back into the morning fog like a gray serpent. Kowalski watched them through a gap in the snow-covered branches. He counted cadence in his head, waiting for the moment when the maximum number of enemy soldiers would be trapped in the narrowest section of road. His hands shook, but not from cold. Every instinct screamed at him to open fire immediately, to release the unbearable tension coiling in his chest. But he had learned something in the frozen hell of Bastogne that no training manual taught. The side that fires first does not always win. The side that waits until the enemy cannot retreat, cannot maneuver, cannot do anything but die, that side writes the after-action reports. He waited until the German scouts were 20 yards past Eddie Price's position. Waited until the main column was compressed so tightly that men walked shoulder to shoulder, their rifles slung, their faces numb with cold and exhaustion. Waited until he could see a German officer consulting a map, his back turned to the ridgeline. And then Sergeant Frank Kowalski, steelworker from Pittsburgh, gave the only order that mattered. Now. The sound was apocalyptic. 12 rifles firing simultaneously in the enclosed space of a forest road do not crack, they roar, a continuous thunderclap that obliterates thought and reduces the world to pure concussive force. The German column simply disintegrated. Men fell in clumps, in rows like wheat before a scythe. The scouts spun around, trying to locate the source of fire, and were cut down before they could raise their weapons. The main body surged forward, then backward, then froze in confused terror as bullets carved through their ranks from 2 directions at once. Officers shouted orders that no one could hear over the hammering of Eddie Price's BAR, which fired in short, precise bursts, each one tearing through 3 or 4 men standing too close together. For 40 seconds, the ambush was perfect, surgical, a textbook execution of fields of fire and interlocking sectors. The Germans had no cover on the road itself, just open snow and the corpses of their comrades. Those who tried to climb the ridges were shot before they made it 3 steps. Those who ran back toward the valley were silhouetted against the snow and picked off one by one. In that first brutal exchange, Kampfgruppe Nordwind lost 100 men, a fifth of their strength, gone in less than a minute.
But 500 soldiers did not simply collapse because 100 fall. They are trained, even in desperation, to react. And the Germans had been trained in the harshest school imaginable, the Eastern Front, where a single mistake meant annihilation. A sergeant, later identified from documents as Hans Kruger, veteran of Stalingrad, screamed at his men to take cover in the drainage ditches on either side of the road. Another officer organized a base of fire, pouring rifle and machine gun rounds blindly into the ridgelines. They could not see their attackers clearly, but they understood the geometry of the ambush now, and geometry could be countered with volume. Within 90 seconds, the Germans had transformed from a panicked mob into a functional fighting force, and the battle shifted from massacre to siege. This was the moment Sergeant Kowalski had not planned for.
In every training scenario, the ambush ended with the enemy retreating or surrendering. But these Germans were not retreating. They were digging in, returning fire, and they had numbers that no amount of tactical brilliance could erase. Kowalski's squad had perhaps 60 seconds before the Germans organized a flanking maneuver, before weight of numbers overwhelmed precision. He could hear his men shouting for more ammunition. He could see muzzle flashes erupting from the drainage ditches below as German machine guns found their range. And he realized, with the cold clarity of a man staring at his own death, that they had created a situation from which there was no extraction. They had stopped 500 men. Now those 500 men were going to kill them. But then, something happened that no German doctrine, no tactical manual, no veteran of the Eastern Front could have predicted. The Americans did not try to retreat. They did something far stranger, far more unsettling. They began to laugh. It started with Eddie Price, crouched behind his rotting stump, his BAR barrel glowing red from sustained fire. He let out a wild, breathless cackle that cut through the gunfire like a knife. Then Harlan Webb joined in, his Tennessee drawl stretched into a high, manic giggle. One by one, the entire squad began to laugh, not with humor, but with the unhinged euphoria of men who had crossed some invisible threshold where fear transforms into its opposite. They laughed as they fired. They laughed as bullets snapped through the branches above their heads. They laughed because they were 12 men holding off 500, and the sheer absurdity of it had severed their connection to sanity. The Germans heard that laughter echoing through the frozen forest, and it unnerved them in ways that gunfire could not. There is a rational terror to being shot at. You take cover, you return fire, you follow procedures drilled into you through repetition. But laughter from an enemy who should be fleeing, who should be begging for mercy, who instead sounds like men celebrating their own funeral, that suggests something beyond tactics. It suggests fanaticism. It suggests that the Americans on those ridges were not normal soldiers, but something else entirely, some breed of warrior who welcomed death as a joke. Otto Brandt, the German captain, felt it ripple through his men. The hesitation, the doubt. He screamed at them to advance, to storm the ridges, to crush this insane handful of defenders through sheer mass. But hesitation is contagious in combat. And while his officers organized assault teams, while sergeants dragged men out of the ditches and formed skirmish lines, precious minutes slipped away. Minutes that Sergeant Kowalski used not to retreat, but to redistribute ammunition, to reposition his two best marksmen to cover the most likely approach routes, to transform his ambush into a fortress. The first German assault came at 9:03 hours. 40 men charging up the right ridge in a ragged line, firing from the hip, screaming to drown out their fear. They made it halfway before Eddie Price's BAR cut the center of their formation apart. The survivors reached the tree line and were met with grenades. Precious grenades the Americans had been saving, rolled down the slope to explode in the midst of men with no cover. The assault broke. The Germans tumbled back down the ridge, leaving their dead tangled in the frozen brambles.
The second assault was better coordinated. 2 prongs, hitting both ridges simultaneously while machine guns suppressed the American positions. This time, the Germans reached the top. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the snow, rifle butts and knives and fists, men grappling in the freezing mud. One American, a kid from Brooklyn named Sal Torino, was bayoneted through the shoulder and still managed to shoot his attacker in the chest at point-blank range before collapsing. Another, a farm boy from Kansas, fought with an entrenching tool when his rifle jammed, splitting a German skull before taking 2 bullets to the leg. But the Americans held, barely, by fingernails and fury and the irrational refusal to accept what should have been inevitable. The Germans fell back again, leaving 20 more dead on the slopes, and in the sudden silence that followed, as both sides gasped for breath and reloaded with trembling hands, Otto Brandt realized he had lost something more valuable than men. He had lost time. It was now 0920 hours. They had been pinned down for half an hour, and half an hour, in the fluid chaos of a collapsing front, was an eternity. 3 miles to the south, American listening posts had heard the sustained gunfire. Company commanders had sent scouts to investigate. Radio operators were frantically trying to raise anyone in the northern sector. And in a farmhouse converted to a battalion command post, a major named William Hargrove was staring at a map, tracing the sound of battle to its source and realizing that someone, impossibly, was holding the logging road. He did not know it was 12 men. He assumed it was a platoon at minimum, perhaps reinforced with a machine gun section. But it did not matter. What mattered was that the Germans were stuck there, unable to advance, unable to retreat without exposing themselves to fire. And a stuck enemy is a dead enemy. Hargrove grabbed every available unit, a platoon here, a mortar team there, even a pair of tank destroyers that had been refueling. He threw them north in a hasty counterattack, not to rescue the defenders, but to exploit the opportunity they had created, to slam the door shut on Kampfgruppe Nordwind while they were trapped in the valley. Otto Brandt saw the trap closing. His scouts reported American infantry moving through the forest to the south. His radio operator picked up distant engine noise, vehicles, possibly armor. He had perhaps 15 minutes before his battle group was surrounded. He made the only decision a commander could make in that position: retreat. Pull back into the valley, regroup, and find another route eastward. He gave the order. His men began to disengage, pulling back from the ridgelines, dragging their wounded with them. And that was when Sergeant Kowalski made his final, reckless gamble. He ordered his squad to pursue. It was insane. They were down to 9 effective fighters. They had less than 50 rounds per man. They were exhausted, frostbitten, some of them bleeding from wounds they had not yet acknowledged. And Kowalski was ordering them to chase 500 retreating Germans into open ground. But he understood something fundamental about the psychology of retreat. A retreating enemy, even one with superior numbers, is already halfway to defeat it. Their backs are turned, their cohesion is fracturing, and if pressure is maintained, if they believe the pursuit is endless and merciless, they do not regroup, they rout. So the 9 Americans came down from the ridges like furies, firing as they advanced, screaming like madmen, pursuing the German rear guard with a ferocity that defied all logic. They did not chase far, perhaps 200 yards, before their ammunition ran dry and their legs gave out. But it was enough. The Germans did not turn to fight, they ran. And when Major Hargrove's counterattack force arrived 10 minutes later, they found not a battle group preparing to resist, but a disorganized mob stumbling through the snow, throwing down their weapons, raising their hands in surrender. Kampfgruppe Nordwind ceased to exist as a fighting force that morning. 340 soldiers surrendered in the valley. Another 90 lay dead on the logging road in the ridges. The rest scattered into the forest and were hunted down over the next 2 days. The planned assault on Malmedy never happened. The supply depot was never threatened. And the German breakout that Otto Brandt's superiors had desperately needed was crushed before it began. Not by overwhelming force, not by air superiority or artillery barrages, but by 12 Americans who refused to move.
When Hargrove's men found Kowalski's squad, they were sitting in the snow beside the logging road, too exhausted to stand. Eddie Price's hands were blistered from firing his BAR for 40 continuous minutes. Harlan Webb was bandaging Sal Torino's shoulder with strips torn from a dead German's coat. Kowalski himself was staring at the pile of spent brass casings around his position, counting under his breath, as if trying to calculate whether they had really fired enough bullets to justify what had just happened. A lieutenant from the relief force asked Kowalski how many men he had commanded in the ambush. Kowalski looked up at him with eyes that had aged a decade in an hour and said, 12, started with 12. The lieutenant waited for clarification. Where was the rest of the company? Where were the machine guns? Where was the artillery support? But there was no clarification to give. Just 12 men, 12 rifles, and a logging road in the Ardennes where the snow was no longer white. The after-action report filed by Major Hargrove was met with skepticism at division headquarters. Officers who had not been there assumed errors in accounting, that the number of defenders must have been underreported, that someone had confused a platoon for a squad. A colonel flew in from Corps to interview the survivors personally, convinced he would uncover some discrepancy. He left 3 hours later in silence, carrying a list of names that he would personally submit for decorations. Kowalski would receive the Distinguished Service Cross. Price and Webb would get Silver Stars. Every member of the squad would be awarded the Bronze Star with V device for valor. But medals are poor translation for what happened on that frozen road. They are words stamped in metal, trying to contain an experience that defied language. What the Germans felt that morning was not merely defeat, it was the collapse of a carefully constructed narrative. For 5 years, Wehrmacht doctrine had preached the superiority of discipline, of coordinated mass, of overwhelming force applied at a decisive point. It had worked in Poland, it had worked in France, it had even worked for a time in Russia. But in the Ardennes, in the closing days of a war already lost, 500 disciplined soldiers had been stopped by 12 men who had no business surviving, let alone winning. And that contradiction, the sheer impossibility of it, poisoned whatever remained of German confidence. If 12 Americans could do this, what would 100 do? What would 1,000? How do you fight an enemy who treats mathematics as a suggestion rather than a law? There was something uniquely American in what Kowalski's squad accomplished, though no one at the time had language for it. It was not bravery in the classical sense, the stoic courage of soldiers holding the line out of duty. It was something wilder, more improvisational. It was the same quality that had allowed American engineers to build airstrips on Pacific atolls in a week, that let factory workers in Detroit retool automobile plants to produce bombers, that transformed sharecroppers and clerks and college kids into a military force that rewrote every assumption about industrial warfare. It was the refusal to accept limitations, the bone-deep belief that rules were made to be rewritten on the fly, that impossible just meant no one had tried the right combination of audacity and recklessness yet. The Germans had a word for it, though they rarely spoke it aloud: Kampfmoral, the will to fight when fighting makes no rational sense. And they had believed, right up until that morning in January, that Kampfmoral was their unique inheritance, forged in the trenches of the First World War and hardened in the frozen steppes of Russia. But the Americans had something the Germans could not replicate. Not discipline, the Wehrmacht had more of that. Not equipment, though American industry certainly helped. What the Americans had was a culture that celebrated the maverick, the underdog, the squad of nobodies who looked at an army and decided that odds were just another obstacle to ignore. That ethos did not come from boot camp. It came from a nation that had spent 2 centuries telling itself stories about frontier settlers and wildcatters and inventors working in garages. It came from a place that treated "because I said so" as an invitation to prove otherwise.
Frank Kowalski never spoke much about the ambush after the war. He went back to Pittsburgh, back to the steel mill, back to a life where the most important decision was whether to work a double shift on Saturday. But men who knew him said he sometimes stopped mid-sentence, staring at nothing, and they understood he was back on that ridge, counting brass casings in the snow. Eddie Price became a school teacher in Iowa and coached high school football. He died in 1981. His players remembered him as a man who never raised his voice, but somehow made you believe you could hit harder than you thought possible. Harlan Webb went home to Tennessee and never left. He raised tobacco and grandchildren and told stories at the general store about everything except the war. The logging road still exists, though it is overgrown now, barely passable even on foot. Locals know the spot. Some years, on the anniversary, a few veterans groups place a small plaque near where the ambush occurred. It does not say much, just the names, the date, the phrase "against all odds." Tourists rarely find it, but foresters working in the area sometimes report an odd phenomenon. In deep winter, when the snow falls heavy and the temperature drops below freezing, the forest grows unnaturally quiet, as if the trees themselves remember what happened there. as if the land is still holding its breath, waiting for the first shot to break the silence. This is the story no grand strategy can explain. It does not fit neatly into the narrative of American industrial might or technological superiority. It cannot be reduced to a lesson in tactics or a case study in leadership. It is simply the record of 12 men who decided, for reasons they probably could not articulate even to themselves, that the logging road was where they would stand, not because they were ordered to, not because retreat was impossible, but because something in them, some stubborn, irrational conviction, insisted that 12 was enough, that 12 had to be enough, because if it was not, then nothing made sense anymore. And they were right. For one impossible morning in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, 12 was enough. 12 rifles, 12 voices shouting defiance into the void. 12 men who looked at 500 and saw not overwhelming odds, but a target-rich environment. That is the terrible, beautiful truth buried in the snow on that logging road. That sometimes, not always, not even often, but sometimes the impossible is just another word for not yet done. And all it takes is a handful of fools stubborn enough to try. The war ended 4 months later. Germany surrendered. The world moved on. But somewhere in the collective memory of every soldier who heard the story, a question remained. What would you have done? Would you have retreated to fight another day, to preserve your force, to follow the sensible calculus of survival? Or would you have stayed, knowing the odds, knowing the cost, and said to yourself, and to history, and to the enemy marching toward you, not one more step, not here, not today. That is the ambush's true legacy. Not the medals, or the body count, or the strategic impact, but the question it carved into the ice. A question without a right answer, only an honest one. And in the frozen silence of a January morning, 12 Americans gave theirs.